I wonder, I once asked romance writer Ann Lowell, who's a good friend, writes mysteries as A.E. Maxwell with her husband, and has some remarkably vivid sex scenes in many of her romance books. And I once said to her, you know, how do you do this? And she said, well, you have to be in the mood, and then what you do is you just write, and you store it all up, you know, and then whenever you need it, you know, sort of like, it's like putting stock in the freezer or something, you know, you make up this huge, but I was fascinated with that she said, you know, you don't really, she didn't write on demand when the scene suggested it in one of her books, that she had this kind of storehouse of material that she could draw upon, and it crossed my mind to wonder whether you had, you know, maybe in a few blazing days, you know, written it all up, and then you just kind of moved it out of your word processing, saved into the right text.
Well, you mean if I feel murderous and there isn't someone around?
Well, whatever. I mean, I just didn't know what technique you use, because, I mean, it's not the sort of thing that it strikes me that you would actually, in ordinary circumstances, spend very much time ever considering.
No, I wrote the killer's diary sections consecutively. I wrote them in a chunk, in sort of a sort of fairly intense and as short as I could make it period of time, because being inside that head, being serious for a moment, was a very uncomfortable place to be. And I felt pretty tired at the end of every working day, because it wasn't a space to inhabit that came naturally to me at all. It was a difficult place to be emotionally, psychologically. So I wanted to get through that bit as fast as I could. And also I wanted to make sure that the voice stayed consistent. I think when you're writing two contrasting voices in a book, then you need to work very hard to make sure that each one is internally consistent. Otherwise, the reader becomes confused, I think, and rightly so. It's the job of the writer to make clear what you're trying to say. So in order to keep the consistency of the voice, I felt it was important to get that sort of, as it were, done and dusted out of the way at the beginning, and then I could almost relax into the investigation stage of the book. And that was, although that was tough at times, it was easier than being inside the killer's head. It's interesting, though, I think, that the experience of reading something like that is actually, in a funny kind of way, more harrowing than writing it.
Why so?
Yeah, well, the reader is having a direct relationship with the text that's on the page. They're reading it, there's nothing to interfere with it. You know yourself how you get lost in a book. You're completely taken over by it. You're in there, you're almost smelling it, seeing it, hearing it. And so when you when you're reading something that's very unpleasant, but that's also engrossing, you're recoiling at the same time as you're being drawn in. And if it's well written and it is horrible, then you do feel appalled. But when you're writing it in a funny kind of way, you're in a different state, because half of your mind at least is occupied with the technique. You're concentrating so hard on getting that sentence right, this sentence right. Does this paragraph read smoothly? Do they flow on together? Is that sentence is definitely clunky. How can I fix it? So you've got your kind of technical head on that almost distances you from the material in a way that the reader doesn't have. The reader's there in the raw with the material, and you're not.
That's an interesting point, and I suppose it helps quite a good deal too, in that, you know, since you're doing it, the reader's only reading it for a relatively short, if intense, period, but you're writing it presumably over quite a long period, and therefore having to live with it. Perhaps that distancing makes that a little more bearable.
Oh, I think so. I mean, you'd be in a completely psychotic state otherwise. You know, I mean, when you think about, if you think about it, you wouldn't want to read the kind of book that leaves you feeling like a wrung-out rag every single day. There are books that, I mean, as a reader, I read entirely different books according to the kind of mood I'm in. And if I've read something that has been particularly challenging and draining and thought-provoking, then I'll go away and read a piece of froth afterwards. But I suppose writing it is probably akin to the experience of just consistently reading one book after another that rocks you back on your heels.
Well, that's what I was wondering, you know, how you could endure it for a prolonged period of time. Tell me, since I assume that this was something that you did because, as you said, this idea came to you in this moment on the motorway, and I must say, I'm so glad you pulled over and didn't smash yourself as a result of all this enthusiasm. Did you ever expect to write another book of this kind?
No, I think that's fair to say. I intended The Mermaid Singing to be a singleton. I already had 2 series established by that point, and I had no intention of starting a third. But I found that the more I progressed with The Mermaid Singing, the more I became involved with the 2 central characters, Tony Hill and Carol Jordan. They developed very commanding presences inside my head and inside my heart. You know, I grew to care a lot about them, and by the end of the book, I felt a pressing need to know what was going to happen to them, where they were going to go from there. They go through, separately and together, some profoundly harrowing experiences in the course of The Mermaid Singing, the sort of experiences that make you question a lot of the ways that you view yourself and the ways that you view the decisions you've made about your life. And I became interested and wanted to know what happened next.
And
so I wrote The Wire in the Blood.
Which is this book here.
That's the one.
And I probably should say that it is the British edition. Val is published in England by Collins. And we are able, fortunately, to bring those books over at the moment. Are there prospects for an American edition of Wire in the Blood?
It's hard to say at the moment. One never knows.
Well, you certainly had an enthusiastic following, as far as I know, on both sides of the Atlantic for The Mermaid Singing, so I hope that that will be the case. When you mentioned Dr. Tony Hill and his, and he is the police officer, and the woman is she also? I'm trying to remember.
No, she's the police officer. He's the psychologist.
That's it. Is it not necessary when you're writing something like a serial killer book to actually have a professional police sleuth of some kind involved?
I think it's very difficult to write that kind of book without a professional police sleuth attached to it. I can't really see how you can resolve the investigation, because in practical terms, the amateur sleuth isn't going to catch a serial killer, or the private eye isn't, by and large, going to catch a serial killer. Although I know sort of some of the classic queens of crime, like Christie and Marsh, have what is effectively serial killers in their books, who are sometimes unmasked by people like Miss Marple. I think, in effect, it's straining credibility too much. I think what you can do, though, is use a healthy antagonism with elements of the police to provoke the sort of kind of conflict that generates sort of tense and suspenseful prose. You can have cops who are opposed to the profiler being brought in The Mermaid Singing for a substantial part of the book. You have cops who don't actually believe that they've got a serial killer on their patch. And that's as much as anything because the victims in The Mermaid Singing are male. And it's very hard, I think, for men to accept the prospect, the possibility of viewing themselves as victims.
And that's, of course, an unusual feature, because most often the victims of serial killers, in real life at least, are women.
Well, I think in real life there's a lot more serial killers of young men than we imagine. As I understand it, it's about 50-50
Is it?
in real life. And one of the things that, one of the reasons why I wanted to explore using male victims in the fiction was that in fiction they're almost exclusively female, the victims. And it almost seems to me that there has grown a trend in recent years of some very, very nasty and very, very violent serial killer novels, where the violence is not there as a functional part of the story, but is there entirely gratuitously. It's there to titillate. It's given a gloss and a glamour. It's almost pornographic. It's supposed to suck you in and make you go, oh wow, this is so exciting, it's so creepy, oh I'm so scared, but gosh, it's thrilling. And in those kind of books where the violence is sort of, as it were, glossy and glamorized and as I say, almost made sexy, the victims are women, but they're not real women. They're kind of cardboard cutout women. They're there purely and simply, it seems to me, to be abducted, raped, mutilated, and their body parts strewn around the highways or whatever. They are disposable. They're not real people. Women don't matter in these books.